There are moments in a person's life that never make the headlines, yet weigh more than any magazine cover. One of those moments occurred in a private home, in the dead of winter in 1989, when a princess stopped smiling for the cameras that weren't there and decided, for the first time, to speak the truth in front of the woman who had been at the center of her pain for years. There were no journalists. There were no microphones. There was no script prepared by palace advisors. There was only a birthday party, a room full of people who already knew the secret, and a woman who decided she was no longer going to pretend she didn't know. Tonight, we are going to reconstruct with respect and with the existing facts what really happened in that room. Before we continue, if this story touches you, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, because here we tell Diana's life with care, without turning her pain into a cheap spectacle. For years, the public only had access to the official version. The tours, the dresses, the rehearsed smiles in front of photographers, the children waving from the balconies of Buckingham. That was the Diana the world applauded. But behind those perfectly lit photographs existed another woman, one who carried a marriage slipping through her fingers while everyone around her asked for patience, discretion, and silence. Tonight, we are not going to inflate this story with unnecessary drama. The facts as they were documented already carry enough weight on their own. We are going to step, pace by pace, into the night Diana finally looked Camilla in the eyes and said what she had been keeping silent for years. Before moving forward, it is only fair to clarify where this story comes from, because the truth needs no embellishment, it only needs reliable sources. Much of what is known about that night comes from Diana's own words, recorded on tapes she prepared herself for writer Andrew Morton, at a time when speaking openly to the press would have been unthinkable for her. Those recordings reached Morton through a trusted intermediary, Dr. James Colthurst, a close friend who acted as a bridge during a time when Diana could not risk speaking directly. Added to this is the testimony of Ken Worf, one of the protection officers who worked closely with her for years, who later recalled in his own memoirs how Diana took control of a situation that many in that circle would have preferred to keep hidden behind good manners. We will keep each source in its proper place. What Diana said in her recordings is one thing, what a close witness recalled later is another, and what was finally recorded publicly, the separation announced in 1992, the final divorce in 1996, Charles's interview with Jonathan Dimbleby in 1994, and Diana's historic interview on Panorama in 1995, is another entirely. We will not invent dialogues, we will not fill in the gaps with palace fantasy. The documented facts are enough to tell this story the way it deserves to be told. Diana married Charles on July 29, 1981, at St. Paul's Cathedral, before the eyes of hundreds of millions of people around the world. For the public, that day marked the beginning of a modern fairy tale, a young, shy, luminous woman capable of awakening a tenderness that the monarchy almost never managed to convey. Soon after came William, born on June 21, 1982, and later Harry, on September 15, 1984. From the outside, the image held up perfectly, a beloved princess, two young children, a future king, a family that seemed to have every reason to stay together. But those who know this kind of life up close know that a photograph never tells what happens when the camera is turned off. Diana fulfilled every one of her duties with genuine dedication. She visited hospitals, held the hands of people others preferred to avoid, sat with terminally ill patients, and listened to mothers and children who felt invisible to the rest of the world. In public, she seemed to grow naturally into her role. In private, according to her own testimony, she felt her marriage falling apart bit by bit, while those around her asked for the exact opposite of what she needed: calm, patience, and silence. The official separation would not come until December 1992, and the divorce would not be finalized until August 1996. But already by the late 1980s, Diana fully understood that Camilla was not a distant rumor or a name that occasionally appeared in the tabloids. She was a real, constant presence, far too close to Charles, far too installed within a life that should have been exclusively hers. And it is precisely this realization that makes the night we are going to talk about so truly significant. Diana did not arrive at that party as a lost or fragile woman. She arrived as someone trapped between two completely different realities, the one the world celebrated from the outside, and the one her inner circle preferred to ignore from the within. The winter of 1989 brought with it a private gathering, the kind that at first glance seems completely harmless, drinks circulating, soft conversations, polite greetings among people who already knew each other all too well. It was Camilla's sister's birthday, and the atmosphere was comfortable for almost everyone present, except for Diana. In those types of gatherings, not much needed to be said. A well-calculated look, an awkward pause, the kind of smile that seems friendly, but actually makes it perfectly clear who belongs to the inner circle and who is barely stepping in from the outside was enough. Diana knew it perfectly. She was not entering neutral territory. She was entering a space where others carried more history, more trust, and more familiarity between them. Neither Camilla nor Charles were strangers in that room. Diana, on the other hand, carried something much heavier than an elegant dress or a royal title. She carried years of restrained glances, conversations cut short halfway through, strange silences that repeated themselves over and over, and that exhausting feeling that those around her knew more than they would ever dare to tell her directly. That is exactly what makes that night so difficult to digest. Diana was not walking toward just any stranger. She was walking toward the name that, according to her own account, had been living inside her marriage for a long time, and she was doing so in a house where she was expected to continue behaving as always, polite, kind, smiling, capable of suffering without inconveniencing anyone around her. Ken Worf was close to her that night, not as a simple guest watching from afar, but as her personal protection officer. His job was not to interpret emotions to sell them later to the press. It was to be attentive, to read the room, and to notice exactly when Diana needed space and when she needed backing. And according to the account he shared years later, Diana began to scan the room for Charles. That detail might seem insignificant, but it is not at all. Looking for your own husband at a party shouldn't be anything extraordinary. But for Diana, that search carried a different tension. The question was not simply where Charles was, but who Charles was with, and that small difference completely changes the weight of the entire scene. Upon finding him near Camilla, Diana saw the exact image she had been dreading to confirm for so long. This was not evidence meant for a courtroom or a photograph intended for the press. It was something much more intimate, much more painful to digest, a closeness that, for her, finally confirmed what she had already been feeling inside for a long time. In that instant, many people would have opted for what their environment expected of them. Swallow the pain, smile out of obligation, and wait to be alone in the car to finally cry or vent away from prying eyes. Diana did not choose that path. And here we must be especially careful with how this part of the story is told, because for years she was unfairly reduced to the image of an emotionally unstable woman, too sensitive, too hurt to act with serenity. But what actually happened that night does not fit that comfortable version so many repeated without questioning. Diana did not lose control. She did not scream in the middle of the party. She did not seek to make a scene so that all the guests would turn to look at her. She did something much firmer, and in a sense much braver. She asked to speak directly with Camilla. The simplicity of that request holds enormous power. Diana simply said she wanted to exchange a few words with her, without drama, without exaggerated gestures, without turning her pain into a show for the rest of the guests. It was a direct request, made in a place where practically no one expected her to take charge of the situation. And that was exactly what Ken Worf would remember clearly years later. Diana took control of that night. Not because the room was on her side, not because she felt safe, and not because fear had suddenly vanished. Quite the contrary. Diana herself would later admit that she was genuinely terrified at that moment. And that detail matters immensely, because courage without any trace of fear sounds nice in theory, but rarely exists in real life. True courage appears precisely when a person's stomach is in knots, when they know perfectly well they might be judged by everyone present, when they understand that a single step can completely change the course of the night, and yet they decide to take it anyway. Think for a moment about that room, not as a royal fairy tale setting, but as a deeply human scene. A young woman, mother of 2 small children, married to the heir to the throne, adored by millions of people around the world, yet completely alone inside a private circle where others moved with a confidence that was constantly denied to her. Outside, they called her the people's princess. Inside, on that particular night, she had to defend something as basic and elemental as her right not to be treated as if she understood absolutely nothing of what was happening right in front of her own eyes. When the men finally left the room, Diana was left face to face with the woman whose name had been weighing on her marriage for years. She did not start that conversation by asking for permission to feel hurt, and that nuance is important. She did not enter looking for someone to soften a version of reality she already knew perfectly well. She did not ask for confirmation of a rumor, nor did she ask to be reassured with carefully chosen words. She was direct. According to the account Diana left in her recordings, she looked at Camilla and told her she knew exactly what was going on between her and Charles. In English, that phrase lands with a simplicity that almost hurts physically to hear. I know what's going on between you and Charles. There is nothing exaggerated about that line. There are no insults, no shouting, not a single word placed there merely to draw attention. It is a clean phrase, almost too serene for all the weight it carried behind it, and for that very reason it acts like a door closing shut. Diana was not asking a question. She was naming the truth out loud, for the first time in front of the right person. For a long time, the public story of that marriage had been told only with shadows and half-truths. The newspapers hinted at things without fully confirming them. Commentators murmured between the lines. Friends on both sides knew fragments of the truth. But it was Diana who always had to appear impeccable, her hair done, dressed up, her face serene, as if the life seen from the outside had absolutely no cracks on the inside. Many women understand that particular kind of humiliation without anyone having to explain it to them in detail. It is not just the pain of feeling betrayed, it is also the pain of having to behave as if you are not seeing it. She didn't need the whole world to be on her side to feel validated. The words came out in a private space, where they probably hurt even more, because right there were the people who had most protected that silence for years. Diana added something else that night, a phrase that makes the whole moment feel even more human and relatable. She asked Camilla not to treat her like an idiot. Don't treat me like an idiot. There, in fact, lies the true emotional core of the entire scene. It was not just I know what's going on. It was don't humiliate me by pretending I don't. That nuance completely changes the reading of the entire night, because Diana was not just fighting for Charles. She was also fighting for her own perception of reality, for her right to trust what her own eyes saw, for her right to not become the last person in the room allowed to finally speak the truth out loud. Camilla's response, according to Diana's own account, did not come with tenderness or a careful explanation. There was no clear apology. What she did, in essence, was place before Diana everything the entire world believed she already possessed: public admiration, 2 beautiful children, a life that, seen entirely from the outside, seemed absolutely fulfilling. That response represents one of the hardest parts of the entire night, because it doesn't directly deny Diana's pain. It simply shifts it somewhere else, as if saying, look at everything you already have, and stop claiming this other thing. But this other thing was, precisely, her own marriage. And there appears the phrase that has remained engraved in this story for decades: I want my husband. It is not a long phrase. It doesn't contain complicated words. It doesn't try to win an argument with rhetorical elegance. It is an almost naked phrase, and precisely because of that, it hurts so much. It doesn't talk about jewels, titles, palaces, or magazine covers. It talks about a basic promise, about the bare minimum a wife expects to receive within her own marriage. That night, Diana made it absolutely clear that the adoration of millions of strangers could never replace the intimacy of a home. That the applause of the public did not fill the void she felt inside her own house. That being loved by the entire world did not mend the deep pain of feeling displaced by a single person. And when Camilla mentioned Diana's children as part of that list of privileges, the blow hit even deeper. William and Harry were not valid arguments in an adult discussion. They were her children, the true center of her entire life. Diana loved being a mother deeply. That was never in doubt to anyone. But using that blessing as if it should automatically compensate for the lack of love within her marriage placed Diana in a deeply unfair position, as if a woman had to accept any kind of wound just because, at the end of the day, she had beautiful children by her side. Diana did not accept that logic, and that is why her response was so clear and direct. She did not say, I want more attention. She did not say, I want to win this argument. She did not say, I want the world to prove me right. She simply said, I want my husband. There lies the absolute contrast between both stances. Camilla presented her with a list of visible external things. Diana responded with a deeply invisible absence. The world saw elegant dresses. Diana wanted loyalty. The world saw flowers and welcoming bouquets. Diana wanted the truth. The world saw a perfect princess. Diana simply wanted to be a wife who didn't feel replaced. While all this was happening, there was another presence weighing on the scene, one that did not need to utter a single word to change absolutely everything: Charles. Perhaps in reality, the most revealing figure in that room was not Camilla, but Charles, precisely because of everything he decided not to do. His silence does not need to be narrated with shouting or turned into a soap opera villain. The story is much more powerful when told exactly as it was remembered by those who were present. Diana found Charles near Camilla, walked into a situation that pained her deeply, asked to speak in private, and then had to say out loud what, in theory, no one else seemed willing to say in her place. That, on its own, is telling enough, because sometimes abandonment doesn't happen when someone physically leaves the room. Sometimes it happens when someone remains close, is a direct witness to your pain, and yet does not stand clearly by your side. That night, the core point was not only that Camilla was present, it was that Charles was too, and in the memory of that moment, his silence remains recorded almost like an invisible wall. Diana was not facing just one woman, she was facing an entire private system of evasion, good manners, and half-truths that had learned to move carefully around her for years. Ken Worf would later recall that both Charles and Camilla looked visibly embarrassed. That small detail speaks volumes on its own. Embarrassment doesn't appear when there is absolutely nothing to understand. It appears precisely when someone has shone a direct light on something others preferred to keep carefully hidden in a dark corner. Years later, in 1994, when journalist Jonathan Dimbleby asked Charles if he had tried to be faithful and honorable within his marriage, he replied that he had, until the relationship became irretrievably broken after both had sincerely tried. That phrase belongs to an entirely different moment, another scene, a public interview where every word had already been carefully measured beforehand. But looking back, the night of 1989 has a completely different temperature. It is not the calculated language of a televised interview, it is the heavy air of a private home. It is Diana seeing exactly what she was seeing, and speaking long before the world heard the official explanations. When Diana finally left that room, the party did not sound exactly the same, at least not to her. The voices continued, the drinks kept circulating, and people continued to move around the house with that characteristic British politeness that knows how to disguise almost any kind of awkwardness. But for Diana, something had already opened up inside. Not because the pain had suddenly ended, not because Charles had suddenly changed his behavior, not because Camilla had magically vanished from her life. None of that happened that night. What changed was something seemingly much smaller, but infinitely deeper at its core. Diana no longer carried alone a truth that until then had no name of its own. According to Ken Worf's recollection, the ride back in the car was not exactly calm at first. There was accumulated tension, there were emotions overflowing after years of containment, there was anger, humiliation, and exhaustion finally leaving her body after being bottled up for so long. And that makes perfect sense. No woman goes through a conversation of that magnitude and returns to the car seat as if she had just left an ordinary dinner. But Worf also noticed something different in her after those first few minutes. Diana seemed more relaxed. Not happy, that word wouldn't quite fit. Nor victorious. Rather, lighter, perhaps clearer, as if a part of her that had been forced to keep silent for too long could finally breathe freely. That difference matters immensely, because sometimes speaking the truth doesn't fix your entire life immediately. Sometimes it doesn't give you back what you had already lost. Sometimes it doesn't even manage to change the other person involved. But it can give you back something that prolonged silence had stripped away over time: clarity. Diana had finally spoken what no one else wanted her to say out loud. Charles had heard it directly, Camilla had heard it too, and the entire private circle surrounding that story had felt it in some way, even without being present in the conversation. It was no longer a shapeless shadow. It was no longer an insinuation hidden behind elegant greetings and smiles of compromise. Years later, in 1995, Diana would say in front of millions of viewers that there were, in fact, 3 of them in her marriage. That phrase became one of the most remembered of her entire public life. But when she finally uttered it in front of the panorama cameras, that phrase did not come out of nowhere. It remains alive precisely because almost anyone can recognize what it feels like when someone points out absolutely everything you have, except for the one thing you are actually losing. Diana was not looking for the whole world to applaud her that night. She was simply seeking to no longer be shut out of the truth of her own life. And that is exactly what makes Camilla's response so revealing over time, because it exposes a massive difference between appearing to have it all and feeling deeply alone in the middle of a room full of people. Diana had the admiring gaze of millions of people around the world. But at that specific moment, the only thing she truly desired was the honest gaze of her own husband. She had 2 children whom she loved with all her heart, but that did not make the pain of a deeply broken marriage any less real. She had a title that people always pronounced with respect, but no title in the world can embrace a woman when she returns home with a completely broken heart. Ken Worf did not need to turn that night into an exaggerated legend for it to retain all its real power. His testimony carries weight, precisely because it comes from someone who was present as a protector, not as a commentator looking for an eye-catching headline. He was not drafting phrases to sell a melodramatic scene. He was near Diana at a moment when the atmosphere in the room could change radically in a matter of seconds, and what he remembered with total clarity was this: Diana took absolute control of the situation. That doesn't mean she didn't feel afraid. It doesn't mean the conversation didn't affect her deeply on the inside. It simply means that despite the fear, she did exactly what the rest of the room never expected of her. Perhaps that is the part of Diana's story that has been most misunderstood over the years. Her strength did not always look like the strength many expected to see, the kind that only recognizes obvious toughness and shouting. Sometimes it was a quiet strength. Sometimes she trembled visibly as she spoke. Sometimes it was accompanied by tears that came later, in the privacy of the car. But it was still, without a doubt, a genuine strength. Because there are women who raise their voices and everyone immediately calls them brave, and there are also women who speak softly with a completely broken heart, and yet still end up completely changing the atmosphere of an entire room. Diana did not leave that house healed that winter night in 1989. No conversation, no matter how honest, heals a wound so deep and long-standing. It does not automatically repair a marriage already deteriorated. It does not erase years of accumulated loneliness. It does not transform shame into peace from one moment to the next. But it can mark a clear and definitive boundary. Before that night, others could continue to behave as if Diana simply did not understand what was happening around her. After that night, that was no longer possible. She had spoken, and when a woman who has been pushed for years into silence finally decides to speak, even if the response she receives is cold, even if no one else defends her as they should, even if the whole world still knows absolutely nothing of what happened, something deep within her shifts forever. That was, at its core, the true exit from that party. It was not about a princess winning a random argument. It was not about a wife getting her husband back. It was not about a woman leaving everyone speechless solely out of personal pride. It was about something much more intimate and much deeper. Diana returned to that car, knowing with absolute certainty that she had no longer accepted the role others insisted on assigning her. The role of the woman who always smiles, the role of the woman who never asks questions, the role of the woman who behaves correctly, so that others do not have to give uncomfortable explanations about their own behavior. Diana did not win Charles back that winter night. She won something completely different, and, in many ways, much more valuable. She won the right to never again be treated as if she didn't know exactly what was happening in her own life. That was the real door that opened that night. She did not walk toward Camilla to beg for anything. She did not go to ask for any favors. She did not go to compete for attention inside a room already heavy, with accumulated tension. She walked toward her to put an end to a very concrete and specific humiliation, the constant humiliation of others acting as if she couldn't see what was happening right in front of her eyes within her own life. Years later, that deeply private story would have public echoes that would resonate around the world. Charles would speak openly with Jonathan Dimbleby in 1994, when their marriage was already part of an ongoing national conversation. Diana would speak on Panorama in 1995, and millions of people would hear that phrase that would end up marking her entire public life. But long before that phrase reached a television screen, long before homes listened to it from their living rooms, long before newspapers repeated it the next day on every front page, Diana had already spoken that same truth in another way, not before millions of strangers, but before the only woman who, for her, represented the exact center of that entire wound. Diana was not perfect, and she never needed to be for her story to matter. What she did that winter night was simply, deeply human. She walked toward the truth at the exact moment when everyone around her expected her to keep smiling as if nothing were happening. And for those who still remember those years with fondness, this was never just royal gossip. It was the exact moment when a woman constantly observed by millions of people, and yet profoundly alone, finally decided to stop acting as if she didn't see what was truly happening in her own life. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Here, we continue to remember Diana with respect, with care, and with the truth always first. And if you want to know about the other conversation that would end up changing everything, that historic interview where Diana finally told the entire world what she had already had the courage to say in private years before, don't miss our next video. Here, we will continue to remember her, always with the care she deserves.